he's doing that, I just wanted you all to know I'm a Phillies fan.
Oh, man.
I know this is a great way to warm up a crowd from Atlanta. But I actually say it for a water reason, because there's a vital link between the Delaware River and baseball. Anybody know what that is? In every baseball game, there are about 80 balls used during the game. They come in a box, all nice and shiny. The mud. We've got a ringer. And the pitcher doesn't like it, the umpire doesn't like it, so they rub it to make it a little rough. And there is Lena Blackburn mud that comes from an undisclosed location on the Jersey side of the Delaware River. It's used for all major league teams and most minor league teams. So without the Delaware River, we couldn't have a World Series. And I'm really glad we had a World Series. All right. I really appreciate being invited down to talk to you all today. Water management really is my driver, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of these thoughts. I will be talking about the similarities with the Delaware Basin, some of our history in creating the Basin Commission, some of the history and controversy that was involved, and then I make the leap of offering some recommendations, not knowing as much as I should about your system. So here goes. So I said the history, lessons learned, future struggles, and it's not easy, and it doesn't end, and it's not something you can draw a line in the sand and say, okay, we've got it now. It does continue, and you need a mechanism for that. A little bit about the basin. The basin is up in the Philadelphia, New York area. It starts up in the mountains of New York State, flows down between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and enters the sea down in Delaware Bay, Cape May, New Jersey, Lewis, Delaware. It serves 15 million people, even though it's a fairly small drainage. And whereas you have county governments, we have municipal governments, so there's a lot of political boundaries that are involved in the basin. But we really need to look at it holistically, because water crosses political boundaries and needs to be looked at in a basin context. It is the longest undammed river east of the Mississippi. There are major reservoirs on the tributaries, but nothing on the main stem. And speaking of reservoirs, New York City has 3 very large reservoirs up in the headwaters, totaling 271 billion gallons of water. So we don't have a city like Atlanta in the headwaters, but New York City gets half its drinking water from our headwaters and exports it out of the basin. As you come down, the cold water releases from the reservoirs have created a world-class trout fishery. People come from Montana to fish in the Delaware. And it really is a wonderful recreation resource. As you come down to the tidal portion, if you know the area, the tide goes up to Trenton, New Jersey. The dark spot there is Philadelphia. And the whole complex, the port complex, is the largest freshwater port in the world when you look at Philadelphia, Camden, Wilmington. But then as you go on down to the bay, there are some very critical natural resources that also need to be protected, so working river and natural wonders. So why was the DRBC created? We were created in 1961 and won, as we'll be talking more about, major disputes over water supply and allocation of the basin's waters. The Delaware River was severely polluted in the Philadelphia area. They used to say that pilots would be flying into the Philadelphia airport and know they were close because they could smell the river. And there was also serious flooding. Our flood of record was in 1955 with 2 hurricanes that came back to back. The drivers of forming the commission is that there had been 2 Supreme Court cases. There were always threats that from one state or another of trying to be the renegade and disband, so they wanted to have a way to bring people together. The The Supreme Court had made allocations, I'll talk more about that, but the Supreme Court also gave the parties the ability to come back and relook at those allocations. There had been a number of studies by the Corps of Engineers and others prioritizing projects in the basin, storage and otherwise, and to make those projects move forward, there had to be a multiple state process, and so they didn't want people to back away from funding those projects or supporting those projects. And from stakeholder perspective, the Water Resource Association of the Delaware River Basin, which is now mostly water and electric utilities, but then also included a number of environmental members, commissioned a study with a think tank from a university, I'm forgetting which university right now, but to look at different mechanisms. So that was a real driver that stakeholders initiated, and as everyone says now, the stars were aligned. It was signed into law by President Kennedy in 1961. There are 5 members, the governors of the 4 states, and then a general in the Corps of Engineers who represents the president, and when he votes for all federal agencies. So he's voting for Fish and Wildlife, EPA, etc. Each of those has a representative. Usually the head of the department, DEP, or head of water within the DEP will actually be the alternate that comes to the meetings and is most engaged. But it does the issues get up to the governor's office. One interesting thing that I thought would ring a bell here is that in the actual compact forming the DRBC, they made a commitment to work through the commission. The compact lasts for 100 years. Our 50th anniversary is coming up in 2011. And the states and their member agencies, so this would be New York and New York City, agreed for the duration of that compact, they would waive and relinquish any right to essentially go back to the Supreme Court and reopen the case. So they're going to work together and work it out. As far as powers, the compact gives the commission really strong powers, and we have not used all the powers that have been given, but it goes beyond planning. There's a regulatory role, water management role, and also project development, so that we really can implement programs for the whole basin. This just shows you some of the responsibilities or functions that we are involved with. You see regulatory permitting there. It's both water withdrawal, groundwater and surface water, and water quality. Besides staff, I have a staff of 45, most of them technical, some community outreach and attorneys, but mostly engineers and PhDs. But we really work through advisory committees. And these could be made up of the technical representatives of the states, but also the regulated community, environmental community, academic community, so that we're bringing ideas up to the commissioners, not just staff-generated ideas. Why does it work? One, it's a level playing field. The federal government doesn't get any more than the states. They get one vote. The members essentially have given up part of their sovereignty, state sovereignty, to come together to manage a basin on a watershed approach. You know, not political boundaries, but a watershed approach. It provides uniform authority across the basin. The states can have more stringent levels, but we set a floor on some of the regulatory issues or project development issues. And I think the bottom two are really the most significant. We provide that place where stakeholders can come together and fight out issues, discuss issues, really bring it together and bubble it up to the commissioners, and Mother Nature changes. She's always throwing curveballs, so you have to be able to adapt, and so we provide that forum. Okay, let's talk about water supply. The Commission also does water quality, but I've really focused this presentation on water supply. This is the second largest reservoir of New York City up in the headwaters, and this is what it looked like in 2001, which is not the drought of record, the lowest it's been since it was constructed. So we have issues also. Again, these are the three reservoirs, just to get it started. And this is a different perspective. The main river on this slide is actually the Hudson, with Manhattan down at the bottom. And so you can see New York City has the Croton watershed, some reservoirs, what they call west of Hudson, and then the three Delaware reservoirs that, one, the water is not filtered. When you go to New York City and they win all the contests, you are drinking Delaware River water, and half of it's coming, and it's a really engineering marvel of all gravity feed right down to Manhattan. But we need to look at it on a system approach, because it's very critical to have freshwater flows coming down the river. One, from a drinking water perspective, this is now, we've come down to the bottom of the watershed in Philadelphia, and there are major intakes, water supply intakes in Philadelphia, and also opposite on the Jersey side. Philadelphia takes about 300 million gallons a day, has a population of about 1.5 million. And if there's not enough fresh water coming down the river, the salt can sneak up from the bay and get in those intakes. There's also oil refineries and other uses of the river that could have corrosion problems, and others if the salt gets up there. In the 1960s, it was within 9 miles of the intake, and there's a 12-mile tidal excursion. So it's something we don't want to duplicate, and it's something we manage, which I'll talk about. So again, the lesson, we need to look at the whole basin. Okay, so what's all the conflict? Where's the Delaware? And let me say, I've tried to read some about your basin, and it is a very complex basin. And I go back and I say, I thought I had trouble. Delaware's simple compared to the things you're dealing with. So I feel for you, and I hope we can work together in the future to try and keep moving on this. But conflict in the Delaware. One, New York City decided to go up to the mountains for their water supply. It was back at the turn of the century. They started looking at putting reservoirs in the headwaters, as any good down basin state would do if somebody started damming up your headwaters. They sued New York. New Jersey sued New York. Pennsylvania joined the suit. Later, Delaware joined the suit. And of course, if a state sues a state, it goes into the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in 1954 set some bounds. And they said, yes, New York City, you can take water, and you can take up to 800 million gallons out of the basin to New York City. That's a large amount of water out of the basin. They also said to New Jersey that through a canal sort of down where the New in New Jersey is, they can take water to feed the central part of New Jersey. So that, again, is an out-of-basin transfer. They also said to protect the river where that red circle is, we're going to set a target of 1750 cubic feet per second based on 0.5 CFS per square mile of the watershed above it. That's how they came up with that number. And that's what the down basin states are going to get. Okay, so this was 1954. Everybody's saying it may not be the best, but it's okay, we'll get started. Well, 1960s rolled around and we had a multi-year drought. And it turned out that there was not enough water to go around. Does this sound familiar? And the mayor of New York said, I have two commitments. I have to provide water to my citizens who vote for me, and I need to send enough water down the Delaware for those other folks. But I don't have enough to go around, so what do you think he did? He turned off the tap, and there was no water coming down the Delaware. So the states were going to go back to the Supreme Court, but they said, we just made this DRBC in 1961. We said we were going to work together. We didn't expect to have these kind of problems right away, but they used DRBC as the forum to work things out. And that's what we try and avoid. And so where are we? How do you manage water when there's not enough to go around? One is back to court. They decided not to do that. They looked toward the equitable allocation, which is the way eastern water is thought of through the DRBC. And what happened with that is something called the Good Faith Agreement. There was something right during the 60s to get through the drought, and then it kept evolving to the 1980s. But one, we count on the water from New York City, but DRBC also worked with the Corps of Engineers and owns water in 2 other reservoirs downstream, so that we can call for releases from those reservoirs if it starts to get dry and we're afraid the estuary and the water supplies down by Philadelphia are going to be harmed. So we can call for that water. We also have a target at Trenton now of 3,000 cubic feet per second to maintain those salt boundaries. What we also put in place was a water supply fund. So this is a charge to water users. There's one rate for raw water and a higher rate for consumptive water use. And we use that money to pay the Corps for the principal and O&M on those reservoirs. And also a part of that goes to supporting staff that are totally involved with water supply issues. We also put together an operating plan. I shouldn't say we, the parties to the decree working with DRBC. And I'll go through this now. If people have questions, we can certainly go back to it. This is based on the total amount of water in all 3 New York City reservoirs. So that darker blue line is the mean amount of water across the year in the reservoirs. The x-axis down the bottom is just the months of the year. And if you go on our website, it just keeps going forward a day at a time. The magenta line is the actual. This was the one back in 2001. I have some copies with me today of the situation now. But you can see it stopped raining in July of that year, and the water levels plummeted in the basin, in the reservoirs. But we have this operating curve so that when it hits the green, the drought watch, something clicks into place. I'll tell you what. When it hits drought warning, something else happens. And then when it gets to drought emergency, additional things happen and more powers are allowed. What happens is the decree parties agreed on this operating matrix. So the normal operations, if you read across there, say that New York can take 800 million gallons a day, New Jersey gets 100, Montague gets 1750, etc. As you go down through drought watch, drought warning, and drought emergency, New York City takes less, 680, 560, 520. New Jersey takes less, the river gets less, both at Montague and Trenton, so that it equalizes the hurt. You know, it's trying to do that allocation so that if we know we don't have as much water as we had, well then we need to share that pain of having not enough water. And that has worked. Knock on wood, we've never had to tell companies to cut back on their water use. We have asked them to do conservation plans and what it would mean if they cut back 10%, 15%, 25% for their bottom line and their employees, but we've never had to institute that. So, Supreme Court set a strict line in the sand, but there has to be this entity, this forum that allows people to work things out, and that's why we're there. And just to show you, it's an always changing game. This was the Palmer Index back in the 1960s, and you can see up by the Delaware Basin, we were the driest part of the nation. I know you may have seen these maps where you have also been that very dry color. But over the last 6 years, you see that sort of blueberry color, we have been the wettest part of the nation. So you really have to be adaptive. And we've always been the river of droughts. and all our plans are toward droughts. So this is a different system for us, or a different problem. Speaking of being adaptive, when the Supreme Court worked all this out, they didn't do anything for the critters. There was no conservation releases from the reservoirs, so the parties had to get together and figure out how to support this trout fishery that had been created and how to look at ecological flows. It's not only the trout fishery, but we have an endangered mussel species up in the tailwaters of those reservoirs, and Fish and Wildlife is doing studies now. There are concerns about the estuary, but we really don't have the studies yet, whether the oysters need certain freshwater flushes, anadromous fishes, tidal freshwater marshes, what are the flow needs for these systems? We established a subcommittee for ecological flows that has TNC, Nature Conservancy, Trout Unlimited, Academy of Natural Sciences, state fisheries, to look at some of those issues. But the water suppliers still rule the day, and that's something we may want to talk about. We had not had a major flood since 1955, and we had 3 in less than 2 years, 2004 to 2006, so that has also changed the way we need to look at reservoir management. New York City reservoirs have no flood control because they were built for water supply, so their aim is to get it as full as possible, hold every drop so it can be full on June 1st, which is the beginning of their water year. So difficulties we've run into. One, because of the decree, DRBC cannot do anything unless New York City agrees. So we need a unanimous vote. New York City, the 4 states, and then finally the Corps of Engineers when they represent on DRBC. So it makes for very slow negotiations. As I mentioned, it's always been about water supply, but now there's an equal voice for ecological needs and flood mitigation. So how do we fit all that together? Once an allocation is made, it's very hard to change it. New York City clings to that 800 million gallons, and even though they use only about 550 now, 600 million gallons a day, there's no way that they're going to give up that rate to 800. And also we need data. And most importantly, there's no silver bullet. Everybody thinks that, well, if we just change this reservoir operation, it will fix the system. And it's going to take conservation measures, it's going to take, water supply reservoirs measures, it's going to take non-point measures. I mean, there's just all kind of things that have to be in the mix. What we're looking at now is what the needs of the dwarf wedge mussel are going to be, and what is the authority of the Endangered Species Act over a Supreme Court decree. We're not sure from a legal perspective how they come together. The estuary demands, we're doing demand analysis to look for future needs in the future. And because that Montague target, that 1750, was set back in the 1950s, we've got better information now. So can we look at different ways of allocating and accounting for the water system? We also have development moving up to the headwaters, a lot of forest loss, and that's going to affect water supply and water quality. Our biggest water demand is energy generation, and with the peaking plants, they're moving on up in the basin. And of course, climate change. And I'm sure this has been an issue in this basin where we know it's coming and we've got to address it, because with sea level rise, that salt is going to get to those Philadelphia intakes sooner. So do we need more storage in the upper basin in order to push that back? What's going to happen to the wetlands? What's going to happen? Philadelphia Airport could be underwater. And what do we do with more intense storms, etc.? A lot of unknowns. Okay, last few slides, and I think these are the most important. So, and hopefully this will breed discussion in the comment period. You really do need a mechanism to bring the decision makers together, because there are always changes. Our scientific understanding what Mother Nature throws at us, our policies and ideas, our socioeconomic directions. And you need an organization, or at least a person, who's thinking about the basin 24/7. Because governors think about state boundaries. You know, everybody has their day job, but when you're thinking about a watershed, you've got to get people to take off those day hats and think about the basin. So, I mean, I think of myself as the nudge. You know, hey, hello, got to think about the basin. That's my job. Really important to have stakeholder support to push people in the right direction. It was the Fishermen Coalition that really got the interest in the ecological flows and created the committee on that. It was the flood victims that are now saying we need to balance how we manage water. You can't just do it for water supply and droughts. And this is the hardest part. How do you get people to stop looking at my needs, you know, my agenda, this is the only thing that matters, to thinking, okay, we've got this much water in the basin, and let's figure out where our goals are and how we can start looking at meeting those. Maybe we can't do everything 110%, but we need to start looking at what those things are and how to approach that. And now for sticking my neck out, I will make a few recommendations. The Corps of Engineers is very engaged in this, from my understanding, and has really been the implementer, and working with another federal agency, Fish and Wildlife, has set a lot of the targets. I think the states have to take ownership. The states are where the people are that will use this water and also get hurt and harmed by different directions a management plan can take. So to me, you need some commission or some way to bring the states together with advisory committees so that you get that input from the fisheries and ecological flows interests, the flood interests, the water supply interests, the hydro interests, just as you all are doing. You need to establish goals and then look at them under normal flows and also drought conditions. Use a model, and I've heard that there are some different models in the basin, to test different scenarios. You know, how close to the target that Florida has met could be gained if you looked at conservation measures as well as reservoir releases and put different pieces together. You know, evaluating it off of different criteria, drought days for the water suppliers. And then actually set a plan. You know, I think it's so hard to get somebody to say, okay, we're going to do this allocation, because you feel it's in concrete, it's written on the tablets of clay coming down from the mountain, and it can't be. It has to change. So put something in place, try it. You know, 3 years, 5 years, get it working, but at the same time, have the commission or whatever the format is to keep working on those issues so that when that 3 to 5 years is over, you've got the next step in the program so that you're ready to reallocate, readjust. And just some examples, some of the things I was reading, like agricultural use, and this may already be in place, but can there be economic incentives put in place so the farmers would use drip irrigation instead of less conserving irrigation? One of the things the Susquehanna River Basin did was they received state and federal money to build a reservoir just to compensate for the consumptive use used by farmers. You know, could something like that be done? Just ideas. But, you know, and all categories could have ideas like that. Most important, your role. I think stakeholders has just been so influential on the direction of the Delaware River Basin. and you are just critically important, and you can really make this move in the direction you want. And I understand that, and just seeing the diversity of people here, that is happening, and you are coming together, which is just wonderful. And that's my last slide, and I offer that if we can be of any help, be sister basins or whatever, we'd love to work with you. So thank you very much. And I guess I can take some questions now. Yes, ma'am. All good questions. From a quantity monitoring, it is mostly USGS stations, Geological Survey stations, and then information collected at the reservoirs themselves. For a quality, we have a coordinated monitoring team. We do monitoring on the main stem in the estuary. We also do toxics monitoring, as well as the basics. Fish flesh monitoring, we're now looking at some of the emergent contaminants. And we have money from EPA through 106 funding to do some of that monitoring. We share with the states, like we send some of the results to the state of Delaware lab, and so we work with them. As far as our base funding is supposed to be a fair share allocation among the commissioners, which they had agreed to back in the early 80s. So it's 25% from Pennsylvania and New Jersey, which was based on population, size of land, territory, 20% from the federal government, 17.5% from New York, and 12.5% from Delaware. The federal government has not paid their fair share since 1996, but that's another story. Sure. Our base budget is around $5 million. Yes. That includes the EPA share, not some of the, we also try and get grants from foundations and others. So it's probably closer to 6.5 totally. Yes, ma'am. My understanding was it was New York State that was really the leader on this. I don't know the gentleman's name. No, it was not a governor. It was somebody, I believe, on the governor's staff, or it was actually somebody from the government, but also somebody from that stakeholder group I mentioned. The WRA had a major influence, the Water Resources Association. If anyone is interested in this, there's an excellent book called Damming the Delaware, and it's about Tox Island Dam, which was never built on the main stem, but it goes back actually to the 1700s and all the water disputes in the basin, and the formation of DRBC. It's by Richard Albert, and I think it's University of Pennsylvania Press. Sure. Okay.
Carol Collier, thank you very much for your informative and provocative presentation. A couple of housekeeping items before we get into our next phase of this forum. Somebody pointed out to me that it was ironic that a forum on managing water resources should provide bottled water, and I've been told this is not what it appears to be. Apparently, Georgia Pacific just today found an aquifer underneath the building. These are spare Dasani bottles, so please don't... Nice try, anyway. I noticed that in Carol's presentation, she described the Delaware River as the largest undammed river east of the Mississippi. People who are intimately familiar with the discussion over managing the resources out of Lake Lanier know that the Chattahoochee is a heavily dammed river as it pertains to this discussion, for sure. I'm Marc Pickard. I am the Earthwatch reporter for WXIA-TV Channel 11. I cover environmental issues, and that is why I'm here this evening. It's my second go-round as an environmental reporter, and I think that's telling. Maybe these issues are finally getting some traction. I think they are. The first time I reported on them was back with the first President Bush, who during his inauguration speech said, "I want to be your environmental president." But at that time, the environment was sort of the right thing to do. Now I think we get the idea that maybe it's not only the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. And I think that's something that resonates across many different areas of our society, and I think is gaining some traction. I'm going to introduce to you our four distinguished panel members tonight. They'll have some things to say. I might throw out a question or two, and then we'll open it up for some questions as well. This could very well turn into the mixed martial art cage fighting version of we're going to lock the doors and let them go at it, and you too. First member of our panel, Wilton Rooks, who currently serves as a board member and vice president, technical programs for the Lake Lanier Association. That's a 4,500-member volunteer group. And by the way, I'm going to introduce everybody, and then one at a time get up and have your say. That's a 4,500-member volunteer group dedicated to preserving water quality and quantity on Lake Sidney Lanier. He also serves as a board member and secretary for the 1071 Coalition. The significance of that number is that's the elevation of the water level at full pool in Lake Lanier. Mr. Rooks has enjoyed water activities on Lake Lanier since 1969, currently lives full-time on the lake. He holds a bachelor and master's degree from Georgia Tech in aeronautical and aerospace engineering. Our next member, as I have him, although he's third down from your right, is Charles Chick Krautler, who is the director of the Atlanta Regional Commission. As head of the official metropolitan planning organization for the 10-county, 66-city Atlanta region, Chick oversees and directs regional planning programs in the areas of transportation, air quality, the environment, land use, water supply and quality, as well as aging services and workforce development. Mr. Krautler began his work in regional planning councils as the executive director of the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. Mr. Krautler has been recognized by Georgia Trend magazine as one of the 100 most influential Georgians. Richard Timmerberg is the executive director of the West Point Lake Coalition. That's a nonprofit chartered to maintain water quality and a stable water level for West Point Lake. The coalition also works to promote and protect the lake's environmental, recreational, and economic developmental roles. A resident of LaGrange, Mr. Timmerberg is also a member of the Upper Chattahoochee Riverkeeper, Georgia Water Coalition, Middle Chattahoochee Water Coalition, Chattahoochee Basin Advisory Committee, and finally West Point Lake Advisory Committee. Prior to becoming executive director of the West Point Lake Coalition, Mr. Timmerberg had a long career with General Mills, retiring in 2002 as Southeast Region Sales Manager. And finally, gentlemen I met about a year ago as I took a trip from the headwaters of the Hooch down to Apalachicola Bay. Dan Tonsmiere has served as the riverkeeper for the Apalachicola River since February of 2004. Before accepting that position, he spent 15 years as a water resource planner with the Northwest Florida Water Management District, where he was coordinator for the development and implementation of the Northwest Florida Surface Water Improvement and Management Program on Apalachicola Bay and River. Prior to that, he was a resident manager for the 1,250-acre Jeff Lewis Wilderness Preserve on Dog Island, Florida, where he facilitated and coordinated research and program development for the Nature Conservancy. Overall, he has combined a 25-year technical experience dealing with issues pertinent to the preservation, protection, and restoration of the Apalachicola River and Bay. So the scene is set for a lively discussion and debate. Let's start with a few remarks from Wilton Rooks.
Thank you, Mark. I want to start out by showing you recently a slide from Lake Lanier. Lake Lanier has a unique position in the ACF. As you probably know, it only has 6% of the watershed, but it stores 64% of the water. It refills the slowest of all the reservoirs, often being in the lowest zone, while the other reservoirs are full, which is a condition that we have today. This slide illustrates the severity of the drought of the water level in January 2008, when it was at almost the same level that we are today. The expectations are that the lake will experience another record low in a few weeks. Recreational use is well established in numerous early documents regarding the purpose of the lake, and the Corps of Engineers has enabled and encouraged not only the values of lakefront property, but the business economy as well by issuing permits and establishing rules and regulations for businesses and recreational users on the lake. Currently, there are about 10,000 permits for residential docks, and there are about 7,000 marina slips. The annual economic impact of the Lake Lanier is for businesses, city and county and the state government is measured in the billions. One of the big differences is municipal water supply and hydropower can be achieved at lake levels much lower than we are today. But the lake economy cannot be sustained at these levels. Businesses fail at this level. The economic impact at these levels is measured in lost jobs and lost lives. Last year, several people drowned due to the factors associated with the low levels. Of course, droughts will happen and will continue to happen. One of the differences is that prior to 2006, the Corps of Engineers Water Control Plan emphasized the replenishment of reservoirs prior to June the 1st. Starting in 2006 with the interim operating plan, the management criteria shifted from water storage to minimum required flow from Woodruff Dam into the Apalachicola River in support of the endangered species. This, even though flow augmentation was never an established purpose for the reservoirs. Last year, during the summer and fall months, 50% of the conservation storage in all the reservoirs was sent to the Gulf of Mexico. This amounted to over 200 billion gallons of water. And it was during that time last fall and winter that Lake Lanier dropped 3 and 4 feet per month until it reached its lowest point toward the end of December. The current IOP virtually guarantees that during extended droughts, Lake Lanier will experience lower lows each year and will never reach levels where it will be a viable contributor to the economy. There will always be localized issues such as these that we present that I've talked about here. However, I believe there are some common goals that all stakeholders could agree on, namely, to eliminate the losses that occur from the ACF to groundwater, to cooling evaporation technology, and transfers to the Atlantic Ocean. Around 90 million gallons is transferred from the Chattahoochee Basin to the Atlantic Ocean every day. These losses hurt every stakeholder from Georgia, Florida, and Alabama. Each municipality and industrial user should make the investment necessary to eliminate these losses. Much of the investment will be in pipes. Much of it will involve using the latest technology for power plants and industrial cooling, as well as irrigation technologies. Municipalities need to take seriously the goal of eliminating the transfer of water from our rivers to surface applications such as occurs with septic tanks. Georgia EPD has established a goal of 58% return to the originating surface water system. The goal should be much higher, and all stakeholders along the ACF should adopt similar goals. The second one is we need to encourage conservation to reduce the consumptive use. You know, in an idealized world, each gallon of water that's taken out of the river would be put back into the river so that downstream users can benefit from it. But we don't live in an idealized world. There will always be consumptive use. So conservation principles need to be followed to reduce the amount of consumptive use. One thing to keep in mind, though, Atlanta only uses between 1 and 2% of the ACF flow in the basin. So it's very hard to conserve and get a significant amount of increased water flowing into Apalachicola through conservation. We need to engage in a competent scientific study by a neutral agency to arrive at a common understanding of the factors that are important to all the stakeholders. How much flow do the endangered species really need? How much water flow is really required for water quality purposes? What are the options for the nuclear and coal-fired power plants to reduce their consumption? Are there viable options even to increase the watershed for Lake Lanier? Sounds like it might be required to move some mountains, but maybe there are some other ideas to increase the watershed availability. Those are only some of the questions. We need to also encourage the Corps of Engineers to accept other professional input that suggests and documents operational rules that will achieve the two primary objectives: retaining more water in the reservoirs and still deliver the minimum required flow from Woodruff Dam into the Apalachicola. I think we have to accept that every user will be impacted by drought conditions. And going back to the point that Carol made, we all will suffer during the drought conditions. But I believe there are some common points that we as stakeholders on the ACF can all agree on. Thank you.
In the interest of comfort, why not just stay right there and make your remarks for the rest of the panel? Sure. Chick Krautler, ARC.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank our guests from out of town for joining us. This is a very important issue, not only for those of us in metropolitan Atlanta, but everyone in the basin. And I think we heard some things from Carol that many of us have been talking about, and it goes to prove that it can work if you make a commitment to it. And I'll also say that Mr. Rooks and I didn't work together on our remarks, but it sounds like we had a lot of the same issues. I'm here tonight really on behalf of the water supply providers in metropolitan Atlanta. They have an obligation to meet the needs of the citizens of this region, and they work together through the ARC to do that. North Georgia is an economic engine that really benefits all of the Southeast. We're the largest metropolitan area in the Southeast. We are normally the fastest growing economy in the Southeast, and to a very large extent that growth has been fueled by not only transportation but by access to water supplies out of the Chattahoochee and out of Lake Lanier. The impact of this drought on North Georgia and the impact of a lack of water supplies really can't be overlooked or overstated. The landscape industry, sod growers in South Georgia, marinas and recreational interests have been hurt very badly in spite of conservation and all of the efforts that we've taken in this region. I'd like to mention a couple of challenges and then talk about some opportunities for progress that might help us move this issue forward. Most importantly, I think, and Carol talked about this, but at least in this basin, I think the issue has become so politicized that it, frankly, is very difficult for the state governments themselves to resolve this problem. It's simply not in the best interest of any of the governors or any of our members of Congress to give an inch in the view of their citizens to reach some kind of a compromise. And that's why we're in court in more courts than we can count right now, none of which is the Supreme Court, which, as Carol said, is the one that ultimately makes the final decision. There are some 3 million residents in North Georgia that rely on Lake Lanier and the Chattahoochee River as their sole source of drinking water. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers' current operating plan for the lake simply doesn't manage the basin's available water in an effective and equitable manner, and this is especially true during drought conditions. An empty Lake Lanier is frankly not in any of the stakeholders' best interests. While the drought has produced low flows in the Apalachicola River, it's also true that the river would be experiencing record low flows if the lake didn't exist or if Atlanta didn't exist. In fact, water use in Metro Atlanta only affects flow at the Florida line by about an inch during normal water conditions and 2 inches or 2% during drought. Farmers in the Flint River use almost 80% more water than we use in metropolitan Atlanta. Mr. Rooks mentioned that the location of Lake Lanier and the size of its holding basin and drainage basin is one of the issues that makes it very difficult for that lake to manage the water flows in the entire basin. There's only some 6% of the land area above the Florida line that drains into Lake Lanier. So most of the water falls below the lake, and there's and it's held in some of the smaller lakes downriver, but not a whole lot of storage is in those lakes. So mostly what's not held ultimately flows into the Gulf of Mexico. Lake Lanier is located at the headwaters, and it's difficult to manage an entire river system with a headwater lake. Metropolitan Atlanta is committed to aggressive water supply, aggressive water conservation. We are, to my knowledge, the only part of the basin that is under mandated water conservation, and we continue to measure reductions year in and year out over the length of this drought. But in fact, water conserved in the metropolitan area really doesn't benefit Florida all that much. So if those are some of the challenges, what are the opportunities? Well, we do believe that there's enough water in this basin to meet all of the needs of all of the stakeholders. Carol mentioned that one of the really key actions in the Delaware Basin was a study, a university-based study that assembled the science and the facts from a neutral party. And we've been advocating that for some time. In fact, both ARC and the state have supported a proposal by a congressman and senator from Florida to hire the national academies to do an independent study of the needs of all the stakeholders in the basin. Carol Couch has offered to pay for a third of that study, and we would hope that our partners would step forward and do their share and not wait for a bill to pass Congress, because as you all know, a bill passing Congress doesn't mean there's any money available, and it'll take years to get an appropriation, and we're not talking about a whole lot of money. Quite frankly, with in deference to my attorney, it would cost less than our legal fees every year. So it makes good sense. There are a lot of opportunities, and when we've had a number of stakeholders who have begun to meet, some of the folks up here on this panel have begun meeting independently to talk about issues, and I think that's where we really begin to make some progress. We need to explore alternatives to the current management plan that's being used by the Corps of Engineers. Currently, the Corps is updating their water control manuals, something that hasn't been done comprehensively in the last 50 years. Many of the stakeholders, ARC and the Metro Water Providers included, have voiced the need to use this opportunity to update reservoir operations and to study alternatives. Above all, the important thing is not to let this opportunity pass. Unfortunately, there's some concern that the Corps may squander this opportunity by simply doing a paper plan that documents their existing operations rather than truly looking at alternatives that might be in the best interests of all of the stakeholders. So I am frankly optimistic. We have more conversations going on today than we've ever had amongst stakeholders throughout the whole basin. We've got the opportunity, I think, to engage a neutral, independent party to assemble the facts. And I think if the facts and the science are known as they were in Delaware, we can begin to make compromises and make decisions that meet everyone's needs in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Chick. Next panel member is Mr. Richard Timmerberg of the West Point Lake Coalition.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening. Once again, I'll emphasize, you're going to hear a lot of commonalities here. So you know, if I were you, I'd think we had colluded on this thing, but I swear we haven't. But I'd like to give you a downstream perspective, downstream Georgia perspective anyway, from West Point Lake. And if you're not aware, the lake's located about 70 miles south of Atlanta in LaGrange. And it's actually on the border of Alabama and Georgia. And the lake is the source of water supply for the city of LaGrange, but it's vitally important to recognize that the lake was funded by taxpayers and specifically authorized by Congress for 5 purposes. And those were hydropower, recreation, sport fishing, wildlife development, navigation, and flood control. Now, in fact, West Point Lake was the first Corps of Engineers lake specifically authorized by Congress for recreation. And it was impounded as a demonstration recreation project with above average numbers of campgrounds, boat ramps, picnic areas, etc. Unfortunately, a review of historical lake levels will show that the Corps has rarely managed West Point Lake as a recreation project. And for that matter, the sport fishing and wildlife development authorization. Consequently, literally hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in economic impact have been lost. We recently had a study completed by the firm of Basile, Bowman, Prost, Cole, and Associates, actually, Carol, near your area, out of Annapolis, Maryland, and showing that West Point Lake has an annual economic impact of some $710 million a year. That's when the lake's managed within 2 feet of full pool. But if you go below 5 feet of full pool, that number plummets down to actually 154 million from that 710 million. So there's numerous and varied stakeholders on the ACF system. Likewise, there's environmental flow requirements, withdrawal and discharge permits, water quality standards, and numerous authorizations for the reservoirs. And these are all requirements which must be incorporated in the basis of any plan. We appreciate and value growth. It's integral to our state's economic well-being, but it has to be smart growth, well thought out, well planned, growth which fits within a community's ability to successfully assimilate it. Take all the water you need, but put it back better than when you took it out. And realizing that transferring wealth from one community to another using water as currency is not only wrong, but a violation of others' riparian rights. There remains a definitive need for more science. There's too much we don't know, there are too many assumptions made, and too many decisions are rendered based on inadequate or non-factual information. To name a few, sewer versus septic, so returns versus consumption, flood control versus flood mitigation. Are they really possible, and if so, to what extent and at what cost? Are freshwater mussels at risk? Are the endangered mussels in Florida really endangered? Or they just happen to be the food of choice for the flathead catfish? Thermonuclear power is not authorized purpose of the federal reservoirs on the ACF system. Is industry stepping up to reduce their water consumption? Are cities and states leading the way, or are they merely pointing fingers at each other? And lastly, are key decision makers really serious about solving this problem and willing to put politics aside? There are numerous lawsuits which have been filed, and I truly believe that the courts are not in a position to reach a conclusion that will be satisfactory to everyone. The states of Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, along with the stakeholders, need to be willing to compromise and appreciate the needs of each other. We need to work together and not work against each other, utilizing facts and science to arrive at a fair and equitable distribution of our valuable water resource. Thank you.
To maintain the environment of our world is a national ecological treasure, within which is embedded one of the last strongholds of a citizenry steeped in cultural heritage and family tradition that believes a deep and humbling respect and knowledge of the family, land, and sea are most important. Our river system is home to more species of plants, birds, fish, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians than any other place in North America. Are you going to give me my slide, Mark? I only got one.
There you go, Dan.
If I had one more slide, I would put up a picture like one of those Red Lobster advertisements that shows a mouth-watering, steaming, hot plate of fresh shrimp, grouper, crab, and oysters to forever implant in your mind that the Apalachicola River and Bay fuel a regional economy based on sustainable use of natural resources that provide fresh seafood harvested from what one internationally renowned artist dubbed the last Great Bay. It has been this way since the 1800s and continues to feed you and us today. This is imperiled, due in large part to reduction of freshwater flows down the river. During dry periods, the spring and summer flows of the growing season have been reduced by 38% since the Corps constructed its dams. Over the last 30 years, we have realized a change in the floodplain forest density with a loss of 4 million trees and a 112,000 acre floodplain. The loss of productivity in the river and bay over the past 2 years is shocking, and prediction for further decline if this continues is sobering. You can read more about this in our newsletter and online at our website. And for the record, the Apalachicola, and for that matter most streams and rivers, cannot be sustained by a minimum flow such as the 5,000 CFS target aimed at protecting mussels. Yet we continue to hear the Georgia leadership claim that withdrawals, nothing personal, aren't affecting the flows on the Apalachicola, or the Corps postulate that if it weren't for the dams, we would not even be getting flows that we're getting now. It is convenient to manage for a set minimum flow, to be able to say, if we can just hit this flow, we're on legal grounds and we can use all the water we want. But before I make you mad, I want you to know that over the over the past 18 months, Apalachicola Riverkeeper staff and our board members have beat a steady path up to Georgia and Alabama, extending ourselves and our resources to meet with our upstream neighbors to offer and clarify information, both refuting disinformation and filling in some of the huge void of information left by the 18-year legal battle, and most importantly, to put a human face on the Apalachicola and foster trustful communication and a better understanding in facts and needs by all of us. Just as I am certain that no one in Atlanta will go thirsty to save endangered mussels, I am just as certain that the protracted legal battle will not leave the Apalachicola system intact as a healthy, functioning river and estuary. The only thing that will sustain the Apalachicola River and Bay will be the citizens and the leaders of Georgia and Alabama caring about whether it survives. Because what you do up here allows us to live down there. It is a decision not just about the downstream users in Florida, but about the rivers, streams, and lakes in your own backyard, and how you foresee the future quality of life in our region as a whole. along the Apalachicola is a very cool place. And I invite you to come and see for yourself what the United Nations designated as one of the world's few man-in-the-biosphere reserves, where conservation and protection of natural resources can sustain economic prosperity and a cultural way of life. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "Men and nature must work hand in hand. The throwing out of balance of the resources of nature throws out of balance also the lives of men." And if I had one more slide, I would show you my son Christopher, who returned injured from Afghanistan last May. And of course, I'm very proud of him and the thousands of young veterans who we honor today. It is for him and your children that we must collectively sacrifice and strive to leave them a world in balance. So thanks for having me.
Thanks to our panel members for certainly outlining the issues very eloquently. I'll get it started, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions from those of us and those of you in the audience. So I think we come here tonight and everybody knows the issues. They've been discussed for 20 years. But I heard a couple of encouraging things, and lately I have heard some encouraging things. We have the example of what Carol was talking about, where in a river basin where there are two mega cities, New York and Philadelphia, they've been able to at least get it started and work it out. I've heard the discussion of let's bring in a neutral, well-respected science to help solve the issue. I've heard discussion of the need for compromise and that the recognition that every stakeholder in the watershed has something to give and has something to gain. So let me ask, it hasn't happened in 20 years. Is something changing now that will make it so? And in my mind, it all seems to come down to trust. Can there be trust in this process that the right issues will be addressed and that everybody will be treated equitably? Anybody can grab it to begin with. Go ahead, Dick.
Thanks, Mark. Obviously, it can be done. Delaware shows that it can be done and it can be maintained basis what Carol and her staff are doing up there. And I was extremely encouraged to see that and commend you, Carol, and everybody up there for the job you're doing. I think Chick hit it. I mean, we got this political consequences going on. And until, at this stage, 3 governors are willing to set aside, you know, their own, and I'll call them selfish interests at this point, even though you expect your elected official to look out for your well-being. But again, as Delaware showed, you have to look at this basin holistically. And heretofore, that's not been done. Everybody's looking at their own little segment and claiming that water. So from my perspective, until you get 3 governors, and of course they failed at it once recently, to sit down and say, hey, we're going to be open about it and let's work out a compromise, and announce publicly that, hey, this is going to be a give and take process, people. So bear with us.
Do we continue to rely on the governors? This might be short-sighted of me, but I can't see a more favorable political climate than what we've had recently. You've got 3 governors of the same party. You had a Republican administration. There was even an opportunity to meet with the Secretary of the Interior in a room, and allegedly something was worked out, and then it wasn't. So we're not going to find a better political climate. Are we still to depend on the political process for this?
Well, again, I think stakeholders can work together and come up with probably several solutions and maybe several viable solutions. But until you get that political buy-in, as they did in Delaware, you're just going to have a bunch of people talking. And until, you know, the key leadership's willing to stand up and say, hey, we're going to have a problem, we need to do something about it, we're just going to continue to talk, unfortunately.
I think that it's going to be difficult to work through the normal political process. A couple of things that Carol said. She mentioned the fact that the Corps ought to be a facilitator, and we've let the Corps be the operator and the decision maker for too long. Regardless of what differences we might have about flows at the Florida line, the Corps doesn't always ask the right questions, and so they get an answer that may not be the best answer. It takes a long time. We've spent 20 years dancing around in various courts and through various processes that are vested in the state governments. The fact that some of these gentlemen are meeting periodically, informally, with the intent, I believe, of expanding that group over time and bringing more folks to the table to talk about needs, is a positive, I think it's a positive step. I think it would be an extraordinarily positive step if Florida and Alabama would agree to Carol Couch's request to co-fund this study by the National Sciences Foundation. Everybody says you've really got to understand the facts, and in spite of, and I would say that if you're worried about what you'll get out of a court, in this more scientific process, as I understand it, the national foundations get input from all the stakeholders. They set what the questions need to be, what questions need to be answered, and then they have an independent body that answers those questions. And we may not like all of the answers, but at least they'll be based on facts rather than speculation or sometimes hyperbole. And so, yeah, I think that we need to look at something different. It hasn't worked. We've seen examples, and we've seen examples where, on the one hand, Alabama will say the Corps has got to update its operating manuals, and then we find out that the senior senator from Alabama has pulled all the money out of the Corps' budget to update the operating manuals. That stuff's been going on for years. We've got to get it out of the political process at some point, or else we have to bite the bullet and go on to the Supreme Court and let the final decision be made and see where we go, because these courts that we're in actually can't make a decision anyway.
Let me comment on the what's been referred to a couple of times about the early attempts of the stakeholders to meet. Dan and I have been part of a group. It was really started, I'm not sure where it started, quite frankly, sort of like Carol, not quite sure who the anonymous person was that started it. Frank Stevens from Gwinnett County, Pat Stevens from ARC, Joe Maltese from the city of LaGrange, Mike Godfrey from the plant farther to Southern Nuclear, and Bill Houston from the Tri-River Council in Alabama. And Dan, we've been meeting for, I guess it goes back to August, was when we met. And it's been very informal. The group had no authority. We did not talk about our own parochial interest. We simply talked about process. How does a group form itself and come into being? And one of the things we decided was that on the trust issue, whoever was the facilitator, they could not have an address in Georgia, Florida, or Alabama for their mail. So we contacted, and they provided their services for no charge initially with the Environmental Conflict Resolution Group out of the Morris K. Udall Institute in Tucson, Arizona. That's about as far away as we could get. And they came in and did worked with us, and in fact had expanded meetings, which I know some of you were at, the one in Gwinnett County, Eufaula, Alabama, Albany, Georgia, and Blountstown, Florida. And the effort there was to expand the stakeholders group to see how large, see how many people would raise their hand and say, I'm interested in being on the mailing list, I'm interested in serving on committee, I'm interested at whatever level. That's basically where it is, and I think it's important to set the expectations for that group at this point. It has no authority. It has no ability to mediate anything. It is simply a group of stakeholders who have come together with a question that says, is there a reason to have another meeting? And so far, there has been a reason to have additional meetings. So hopefully that group will, and that was the basis of some of my comments. I think there are some core elements and core issues that all of us have in common that do not confront the political issues. And I'm always reminded of the metaphor that if your tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Being more technical oriented, I look at all these issues as having a technical solution, which is obviously not going to be 100% accurate. But I think there are some technical issues. Chick has referred to them. We need more data. We need solid data. We need data that are developed by independent sources that everybody can sort of salute and say, oh, is that the way it really works? And we need to get that done, and the National Academy of Science study is very pivotal to getting that done. But hopefully the stakeholder group will continue to have a reason to have next meetings, and the group will expand. And I encourage any of you who represent organizations that who you view yourself as a stakeholder to raise your hand and say, yes, I'd like to be a part of that, because it is intended to be a very inclusive group. And that's sort of where that stands right now.
Go ahead, Dan.
I think I forgot what the question was because we kind of drifted a little bit, but let me just try here. I think Lindsay Thomas, who was the federal representative in the earlier compact negotiations, were said at a recent conference up in Gainesville, I believe it was, that there were three things that made the compact fall apart. One was a lack of agreement on the scientific data. One was fear that minimum flows would become targets. And the third thing was a lack of trust. And the NRC study idea actually was generated out of a river trip that we coordinated on the Apalachicola River with Senator Nelson. So we strongly support that NRC effort, and we have, I would just say, worked diligently to bring our state representative, our state government around to sharing in that. That's another issue. The minimum flows as being targets, I think if you talk to people in the upper basin and in the Flint Basin, it is that the Apalachicola needs 5,000 CFS, and I hope I've made it clear that does not work for keeping an ecological system going. And the trust part of the equation, I think, involves stakeholders, all of us, coming forward and trying to understand what each other's position is. And Carol and I were talking a little bit before the meeting, and I was asking her about, how do you look at your in-stream flow there, and they are just now beginning to try to understand what the ecology needs, whereas before it was a trout fishery similar to what, as I understand, is below the Beaufort Dam. And that's not going to work for the Apalachicola, but I don't know how to get over that trust thing. As I said, we have been trying to make face-to-face contact with folks up here and explain our situation, and Wilton and I and the other folks have met once, and we met with General Schradell, and I think what we have to do is make sure that we're being genuine in our whole effort. And I know the ARC has plans for somewhere between 2 and 6 reservoirs in the headwaters of our river system in the next 15 to 20 years. And I think the fact that Wilton the Lake Lanier Association is moving to form another group that's going to raise $700,000 to advocate for keeping Lake Lanier full. It makes it difficult to come to the table and know that who we are talking with is interested in looking at our point of view and recognizing our needs as well. I know that Lake Lanier's property values hit rock bottom when the lake's dry. I know what waterfront property sells for in St. George Island. I know that the same thing happens to Dick's Lake when they are dry. And I know that Atlanta has a $250-something billion GNP that drives the southeast, and there's no way that that's not important to everybody in the basin. But the point is we have an ecological system that, as they have said, and I agree, that if we really worked hard at it, we can protect that. There may be enough water to squeak through these dry times so that it flourishes, but we allow this disagreement, this continual fight that the governors and states have to avoid getting to some sort of agreement. We will all be worse off in 10 years. There will be more water distributed to more people and less water for all of us to have and to share. So I think the concept is good, and the trust factor is critical, that all the basin is represented, all the stakeholders have that ability to participate on somewhat of an equal footing, and it's a very tenuous situation right now, and I hope it moves forward. I really do. And how we do that is just the ECR didn't have a good idea of how that happens exactly. It's sort of like, well, you can do it. You can do it, and you can, we'll try one more thing. So we'll see how it goes.
In the time remaining, I'd like to give the audience an opportunity to participate. Michael, catch a hand raised here. Yep.
Mr. Krautler, an earlier version of the Metro Water Supply Plan had dams on the main stem of the Flint River. I think the final water supply plan update will be out here in a couple of months. Are you going to include dams on the Flint River in your water supply plan?
There were no dams on the last water supply plan on the mainstream of the Flint River.
Are we done with that? All right.
Carol, I'd like to ask you a question, if I may, please, ma'am. And I don't know how far back you can look, but it seemed to me that one of the driving forces that you showed us on your chart was that, in fact, part of the time that all of this really came together, the Supreme Court, in fact, set allocations among the states, but had the grace and the wisdom to be able then to allow a modification to those upon agreement of the stakeholders. And my real question is, would it have come together had the Supreme Court not put that forcing function in place?
That is an excellent question, and in fact it was something that was discussed a lot on that China trip that was mentioned earlier. It doesn't sound right, but having that line drawn in the sand really got things moving. And that's, if it's possible for either the states or the states pushed by the stakeholders can do it themselves instead of having the Supreme Court do it, that would be the best. But, I think having that line gives you a starting point that you can come around the table and say, okay, we're here, but here are the studies we need to do. Here's we want to do this by the next 3 years, and then we're going to come back together again. Probably going to worked together that whole time, but here's the next increment we need to move. And it's never an ending job. You know, we've got something now in place called the Flexible Flow Management Plan that's a framework, because we know it has to be adaptive, with holes in it, saying, you know, we need to do these estuary studies, and everybody's agreed that when we have more information about the oysters, et cetera, then they need to be put in the process and figure out how we reallocate.
Other questions?
This is just a comment, really, and it's going to sound a little hokey, but I'm going to throw it out here anyway for fear of embarrassment. But you know, one of the issues you mentioned was trusts and trying to build trust amongst the stakeholders in the 3 states, and we all have lived long enough to know that during the Cold War there were cultural exchanges, and even nowadays between Israeli and Palestinians you have cultural exchanges trying to establish human linkages between people and understanding. Consider some kind of effort to get a foundation or somebody to underwrite something like a farmers and fishers kind of exchange, where you take people who are stakeholders but aren't necessarily the professionals, but who still have a stake in the outcome of it, and they spend some time with each other in each other's environments to better understand. It's small steps, but a lot of those kinds of small human exchange steps can do a lot over time to help break down some of the barriers of fear and mistrust that the different local populations have amongst each other.
Well, Wilton and Dan, you guys were saying that's sort of what you're involved in now?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think you're on target. I think you're right. I mean, having Dan as a face on the Apalachicola it certainly changes the way you think and way you look at issues. And I think to a very large degree, one of the factors that has not been incorporated into the stakeholders' initiative so far is, in fact, the farming agricultural community on the Flint River. There's been some efforts to reach out, but that probably is a good way to try to make that happen better, is to have some informal meetings that just relate to, you know, touching base and getting to know people.
We've been kicking this issue around for 20 years, so I don't think we're going to resolve it tonight. We've got time for one more question. The gentleman back over there. Yes, go ahead. Boom it out.
Carol had mentioned that even after 40-some years that they still have data needs. Each of you has discussed data needs and so forth. Some that we don't agree on, a lot that we're lacking. Is there a common sense about the data that we need? I mean, what sorts of questions do we need to have answers to? And maybe more importantly, do we have an agreement about the objectives of that data? The West Point Lake, you talked about what were the objectives of creating that dam, and unless I missed it, I didn't hear water supply as one of those. So, you know, I guess there are a variety of different issues that people have, and I guess, like, if I was the governor, I'd probably have some trepidation because, you know, there's a lot of different perspectives on this, and you don't want to tick off anybody, you know, with some solution. But anyway, I guess the question really is, what are the data needs, and do we know what we want to do with it?
I think there've been some discussions amongst the environmental directors of the 3 states about what the scope of a study might look like, but those haven't been made public. We haven't seen them. I don't know whether anybody else in the group has, but that certainly is a key issue, is figuring out what the goals and objectives and data needs are and agreeing to that before you having some level of agreement before you enter into a study that is going to produce some results that is destined to fail if people don't agree with the goals going in. So I would certainly hope that if we move forward in either one of these efforts to understand the system better, that there would be some set of goals and objectives and data that would be agreed to first, or else we're wasting time.
And I would add that, the ecological flow needs of the Apalachicola, which I've referred to here, is a big missing component. And we have done everything we could to get the state of Florida to come forth with that information. And it is to date not known. And I think we have a problem with the litigation that the states are not being forthcoming with their data. And I know on our little stakeholder conference call with the Corps every couple of weeks, we ask Georgia for data and information, and it seems to be perpetually coming soon. And I'm not taking one side or the other. There's some real problems there, and how we overcome, having a group such that wants to have data, or even the NRC possibly, and the states are holding their cards back because of litigation. It makes for a real dilemma. I think your question's very on the point. How do we get there?
Great, thank you. What a great discussion, what an incredibly important issue, and what a great program. I want to first of all thank thank our speaker, I want to thank our moderator and the panelists for participating in such a great program. I especially want to thank our sponsors, our presenting sponsor, Doug Hooker, PBS&J. And our supporting sponsors, Jordan Jones and Goulding and King and Spalding. And also Georgia Pacific for lending us this terrific space.